Warning: tube amplifiers have lethal voltages inside them. Please do not attempt to build, test, or repair these without understanding and following all safety protocols. Hey y'all! Well, we're ready to finish up installing these ISO Tango transformers on this Willsenton R8, which I know a lot of you folks were like, why are you putting $1,000 transformers on a $1,500 amp? And I'm fixing to show you why. One more little tweak we have to do. Going to show you how we deal with that. And then we're going to get these things on Analog Discovery 2 and show you their performance. So let's get busy. Okay, and as careful as I was trying to follow the schematic, didn't think about that the schematic may not be showing the phasing of the transformer the way it actually is. And turns out that it's phased 180 degrees out from what the wiring diagram shows, which you'd never know unless you were changing the output transformer. So it turned the global negative feedback into global positive feedback. And it's real easy to tell if that's what's going on, because it's like the howling you get from a microphone at a high school auditorium. I know you've all heard that noise. That's what happens when you put a signal into it. And, you know, if you got speakers hooked up, it's not going to be a good thing. If you got dummy loads hooked up, you'll hear it. And so there's two ways to flip the phase. One is to come in here and switch, like this blue wire with this blue wire, this yellow wire with this yellow wire. But if you look at this, these wires are really laid out in the links to be soldered onto the transformers like this. Now, if you had a single output tap, you know, just two wires, you can reverse those two leads, and that'll also flip the phase. But in this case, we have a multi-tap output, and it's not that simple. And so, rather than, you know, switch all these wires on the output transformer and have like this lead stretched and that one, you know, pulled up real tight, and the same thing over on this side, you can see how the leads just lay out really nice. If we swapped all these around, they'd be, some of them would be stretched tight and some of them would be, you know, looped real loose. The easier solution was to swap the two wires up here on the phase splitter going to the bias board. So we're going to unsolder this white wire, move it where this red wire is, and then we're going to connect this red wire where the white wire was. And that will flip the phase. Then instead of this being the positive phase tube and this being the negative, it'll make this one the positive and that one the negative. These tubes don't care which phase they're doing. So let's go in there and flip those real quick. And then you can see this one was disconnected. We're going to be testing the amp with an open gain on one channel and with the feedback loop connected on the other. But while I'm in here looking at this, we're going to go ahead and swap these wires. And this is a whole lot easier than swapping all those wires on the output transformer. As you can see, quick little solder job here. Problem solved. So anyway, if you do run into, when you're working on one of these, you get the output transformer wired out of phase, and you end up with positive global feedback instead of negative feedback, just swap these two wires on the phase splitter, and you're back in business. So let's get this thing hooked up to the Analog Discovery 2 and see what kind of actual performance we're going to get out of these new ISO Tango push-pull output transformers. Okay, so we got the Willsenton R8 hooked up to the audio analyzer suite. I've got one channel that's open loop, i.e. there's no negative feedback connected. And then the other channel, we've got a 24K feedback resistor that is a little more global negative feedback than the amp initially came with. And in previous testing, it seemed to be kind of a sweet spot between, creating problems and instability with controlling the distortion. And I did some basic calculations. This is pretty new to me stuff, but with my analog scope and signal generator, I saw 6 volts in with 50 out, peak to peak. And my calculations, which probably are amateurish, came out to 18.4 dBs. And then when I put the same 6 volts in, I got 30 out on the channel that has the negative feedback. And so it came to 14 dBs. And so the difference between the open loop gain and the closed loop gain is just a little under 4.5 dBs, which is not a lot of global feedback. I think people have noted that before, that with that high a value resistor, that's not a lot of global negative feedback, but it appears to be enough to work with this amplifier. So this screen right here is showing the open loop, or the channel with no negative feedback, and I think this is helpful to kind of show you what the transformers on their own are capable of. And this honestly is surprisingly good. We get 5 watts at 1% distortion. It crosses over 2% distortion at 15 watts. And then up here at the highest power, we're getting 56 watts at just under 4% distortion, which is pretty impressive. So the next thing I wanted to show you was the frequency versus THD, and look how flat this line is. And this is pulling the amp at 10 watts, which if you look at this screen, that's right here at 1.5% distortion. And that's what we're seeing on this chart. We're getting right at 1.5% distortion all the way from 20 hertz to the max that we're measuring this at. Here's the other thing to note. When we do the second order harmonic distortion, you can see the line is identical to the total, or very close to it. When we go to the third order harmonic, boom, it drops way down here. So most of this distortion we're seeing, especially in the 1K and under range, is second order harmonic distortion. The last thing I want to show you is the scope, and I'll show you where we're pulling the scope pattern from. We're pulling it at 0.1 volts, which is just under 10 watts. Actually, it would be 0.11 volts to get 10 watts. So this is it at 0.1 volts RMS. We'll go ahead and add 0.11. This would be at 10 watts. And again, very symmetrical looking waveform. I'm not seeing any distortion from the sine wave. And then if we go to the square wave, and this is at 1K, it's got a little ring here on the front edge, but just instantly drops off. So let's look at what it looks like at 100 hertz. That's super impressive. I mean, that very slight slope there. And then finally, let's see what it is at 10K. And this again with no negative feedback. Again, we're seeing the same little ring on the front end, and then it totally flattens out. And so that's, to me, super impressive performance for a push-pull amp with zero negative feedback running as an ultralinear wired output tube. So we're going to switch over to the other channel here, And this is the channel that has, from my calculations, 4.5 dBs of global negative feedback. Again, it's a 24K resistor where the amp came with a 30K. And let's see what the THD versus power looks like. And as it starts making a little power, it's staying down below 0.1% distortion. And we're just now edging up towards 0.2% distortion. $20, we got 0.3%. And then the line flattens out until it hits this point right here. And that's 50 watts at 0.5% distortion. And then at what the amp previously was rated at 45 watts, we've got under 0.5% distortion. And you'll note we're right at 0.4 volts RMS input. So let's look at our THD versus frequency. So we're going to pull it at 10 watts like we did previously, and then I'm going to pull it at 40 watts and see what that looks like. And this time we've got a little bit of a curve in it, and I think what's going on is this global negative feedback is really pulling the distortion down between this 40 hertz and 1K, which we're seeing it's 0.2% distortion. But even on each end, we're only seeing 0.5% distortion at 20 hertz. And then up here at 5K, again, it's under 0.5% distortion. So let's really stress this thing out and see what it does at 40 watts. Oh, and before I switch from this, there's the second order harmonic graph, and there's a third order. And you can see, especially in this range down here, the majority of the THD is going to be second order harmonic distortion, which is the nice kind that we listen to tube amps for. So let's see what this thing does at 40 watts. And honestly, guys, I've never run an amp with this test at this high power. This is super impressive to me. At 40 watts of power, yeah, down here at 20 hertz, we got 7% distortion. But by the time we get to 30 hertz, it's down to 1%. And then all the way across the board, even up here at 5K, it's under 1%. And that's at 40 watts of power. And usually, output transformers just choke when you start trying to measure them near maximum power. And this one's just cruising along. Now it does, when we get into higher power levels, we lose some of the second order, and they're basically even between the second and third order harmonics. But yeah, that's like at max power levels. And so that's super impressive. Normally an amp with this kind of power, you would have mostly third order and very little second order harmonics at max power. So, because we're definitely in full AB mode at this point. So let's look at our scope. Let's start off at 1K with our sine wave. Again, very symmetrical. That looks really nice. Square wave. I'm hoping we don't see too much ringing. Still got the same spike here, and we've got a little bit of ringing here. And previously I had put a 100 PF to 300 PF cap across the feedback resistor, trying to roll off this overshoot, and may give that a shot after I listen to the amp and play around with different capacitors, what it sounds like, and then remeasure it. let's look at the 100 hertz with the feedback resistor connected. It's actually even flatter. So that's helped the low frequency response, adding the feedback. And then let's see what 10K looks like. Fingers crossed again. Same deal. Got this little ring on the front end, and then it quickly calms down. There's no stability issues whatsoever. Again, I'm going to play with putting a capacitor across this feedback resistor. Start with maybe 100 PF and see if that will tame some of this initial spike. Now, I don't want to make this just completely roll off flat or rounded, because I've done that before on amps and they end up sounding dead. So we don't want to do that. But guys, this is super impressive. We're basically now at 50 watts with these KT88 tubes at 0.5% distortion. And just to make sure we're not into clipping, you can see at 50 watts we got 0.415 volts RMS in. We'll go to 0.415. Hit the sine wave and see. Yeah, it's starting to clip right there. So let's go back here and go back to 0.4 volts, see what that does. So I'll play with the numbers, and 0.38 volts is on the verge of clipping. I think 0.39 we'll probably see just a breath of clipping here on the top. So if we come back over here and we look for where 0.38 volts is, 42.2 watts before it clips. So we're right there at a 45 watt amp prior to clipping, and it's got this little bit of headroom here on the top end up to like 50 watts where, if a transient hits, the amp's still capable of doing it without going into heavy clipping and distortion. So yeah, this is totally a 45 watt amp. So anyway, I think this is a super good result, and now I'm going to hook up the other feedback resistor. I'm going to go listen to this amp. I'm going to play with some different capacitors on the feedback loop, see what that sounds like to my ears, and then we'll probably do one more final Analog Discovery 2 run and an overview of what this amp works like now. And I'm super impressed with the performance of these transformers. And this looks like a great place to wrap up this video. Well, I have to say that's some seriously impressive performance. And it's probably one of the best performing tube amps that I've tested since I've been working on this stuff. And I did give it a short listen, and I think it's going to sound as good as it performs. Like, is this the same sound that you're going to get out of a single-ended triode, like a nice 300B amp? No, it's a different deal. I mean, this is a much higher powered amp. If you've got some, less efficient speakers that you're really in love with, or you've got a much bigger room that you really need this power, this could be it. And again, I know some folks are saying, I don't grasp why you're spending $1,000 on a $1,500 amp. Would I buy an R8 with the intention of spending all this money upgrading it? Maybe not, but maybe so. I'm not sure what you'd have to spend to get performance equal to this out in the real world. Like, what would you have to pay for a tube amp that came pre-built with output transformers of this quality? And the output transformers are what really makes the magic happen. And you put cheap transformers on an amp. We saw that with some of the other made in China amps. There's just, the performance isn't there. And even on my, EL34 amp or my 300B amp, the difference from EdCore, which are definitely a step up from what this amp comes with, to an ISO, was enough where I did that on my personal amps, and I recommend it for my customers. Go ahead and spend the extra money and get the good iron, because you can't beat that. You can't replicate the performance that a good transformer is going to give you in a tube amp. And the other argument that I'd make for doing this is, I know some of you guys, I watch you, you're spending over $1,000 on putting upgrade tubes in one of these amps, buying these new old stock Mullard EL34s that are, $150 or at least $100 a piece, and then by the time you replace all these tubes with new old stock tubes, there's $900 you've spent on tubes, and nobody seems to have any issue doing that. But then when you talk about replacing the transformers with some really nice iron, they think it's ridiculous. And so I think you guys are making a big mistake not considering this. And I showed you in the video, they're really not that hard to install. They fit where the other ones did. They cover up all the holes. They're physically the right size. Whether you want to paint them all to match, that's all up to you. Some people, it's all just about the sound, and you might like the way it looks with, a black power transformer and the factory painted ISO iron. And so, but if you're just looking for the sound, just do that. I was trying to hit an aesthetic too, because possibly could be selling this amp, may end up keeping it, I don't know. And my initial listening is being done with some new old stock Russian tubes in the outboard, Sylvania 6S and 7 in the middle, some Horizon 6SL7s, and some Horizon KT88 power tubes. And I've got a whole slew of other tubes that I'm going to be testing in this amp to see which ones work the best or sound the best, because that's part of, the whole tube thing is finding synergy between the tubes used in an amp. Sometimes changing one tube like this one, you go, wow, that was the magic. That's what it needed. And so, yeah, going to be doing some of that. But for now, I am thoroughly impressed and don't regret for 1 minute putting some good transformers on this amplifier. So I'll put a link below to Tubes USA, where you can buy ISO Tango iron in the U.S. He's the U.S. distributor. George is a super nice guy. Unfortunately, they just had a price increase. I think it was 15%. Kind of warned you all about that a month ago, but here we are. And I'm not sure what the future holds, whether, there's talk of tariffs and stuff that may be happening, may not be happening. I don't know. So if you're thinking about getting this stuff, I'd get it now, because it's just going to get more expensive. So anyway, I think this was a very cool series. I'm going to do one more. I've got to play around with the global negative feedback. I want to try some, 100 to 300 PF capacitance across that 24K feedback resistor. See if I can tame down that little bump or the overshoot, and then also going to be listening to it. What I'll probably be doing is trying those capacitors, maybe like one on one channel, one on the other, get a song or some music that has kind of mono type recording that doesn't have a lot of change from one channel to the other, so it sounds decent listening through one speaker, and that way I can listen to one feedback and then the other and try to see which one sounds the best, kind of A/B in it, and then look at it on a scope and see which one scopes the best too, and try to find, because to me it's the sound. I don't care what the, obviously what the scope's showing has some meaning, but the main thing is what does it sound like. So I'll get that tweaked, and then we'll finalize what the schematic's going to look like. It's probably not going to be different than it was before. It's probably going to be somewhere between 100 and 300 PF is what I recommended with the stock transformers. And this amount of global negative feedback, while not a lot. Some amps run way more global negative feedback than we're running. You can see that it doesn't need it with this good iron. It gets you there. And so, anyway, hope you're enjoying the series. If you are, please subscribe to the channel. Please like the video. Thanks to all you Patreon supporters and you other folks that support Skunkie Designs in other ways. And until the next video, have a nice day.